deep in the jungles of Vietnam. No backup, no way out, and most of them were not coming back. That morning, in the heart of a jungle where officially the United States was not even present, a group of American soldiers faced a reality that few could even begin to imagine. There were no flags. There was no public recognition. There was not even a guarantee that their names would be remembered if something went wrong. And yet, they were there, voluntarily, operating in absolute silence, in enemy territory, knowing that every step could be their last. Those men were not there for fame, nor for medals, nor for glory. They were there because they believed in something greater than themselves. And on that day, among them, was a man who would end up proving exactly what that meant. A man who did not retreat when he should have, who did not abandon when everything indicated it was impossible to continue, and who turned a completely lost situation into a story that, decades later, still stands as one of the greatest examples of courage ever recorded in American military history. His name was Robert L. Outnumbered. On December 30th, 1968, a highly classified reconnaissance team was sent on an extremely delicate mission near the border between Vietnam and Laos. The objective was to locate members of a previous team that had disappeared after making contact with enemy forces. This type of mission already carried an absurd level of risk on its own, but there was one detail that made everything even more dangerous. Those men belonged to MACVSOG, a secret unit that operated outside the official lines of the war, conducting operations in territories where, politically, the United States was not supposed to be. If they were captured, they would not exist. If they were killed, there would be no explanations. It was the kind of mission that required not only skill, but a mental readiness that very few people in the world possessed. And still, they boarded the helicopters without hesitation. As the aircraft began descending toward the landing zone, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The jungle was dense, closed, seemingly calm. But that calm was nothing more than an illusion. The moment the first men touched the ground, the environment exploded into violence. Gunfire erupted from every direction. Hidden machine guns began tearing through the air. Explosions shook the terrain, and within seconds, it became clear that this was not a normal contact. It was a carefully prepared ambush. The enemy was waiting for them. And not just waiting, ready. In far greater numbers, strategically positioned, with total advantage of the terrain, North Vietnamese forces turned that landing zone into an instant hell. American soldiers began to fall before they could even take position. The radio crackled with desperate calls for support. The smoke, the noise, and the chaos made it nearly impossible to understand what was happening around them. In the middle of all this, Robert Howard was thrown directly into the center of what would quickly become one of the most extreme situations a soldier could face. On paper, he was not the kind of man who was supposed to be leading that kind of fight. His original role was logistics, organization, support. But war does not follow roles. War reveals character. And in that moment, even wounded, even surrounded, even watching men fall beside him, Howard did not retreat. He moved forward. He searched for his commander in the middle of the chaos, trying to understand the situation, trying to reorganize what could still be saved. But the truth was brutal. The landing zone was completely compromised. The team was surrounded. And the mission, at that point, was no longer about rescue. It was about survival. And this was only the beginning. What initially seemed like a rescue mission quickly turned into a desperate fight for survival. With the landing zone compromised and the enemy pressing in from all sides, the only viable option was to get out. But getting out did not simply mean retreating. It meant moving through enemy territory under constant fire, carrying the wounded, trying to maintain some level of organization in a scenario that, with every passing second, became more chaotic. The lieutenant in charge of the team made the decision to push toward higher ground, an attempt to gain some advantage and reorganize the men. It was a risky decision, but at that moment, there were no safe choices, only possible ones. As the group moved, the pattern of the attack began to change. Sporadic gunfire came from the flanks, as if the enemy was guiding the platoon in a specific direction. It was a classic encirclement maneuver, leading them straight into a larger trap. And that is exactly what happened. Within moments, they entered a new ambush, even more violent than the first. A nearby explosion threw Robert Howard backward, completely destroying his weapon. The impact left him momentarily unconscious. When he regained his senses, the reality around him was even worse than before. His vision was impaired, blood ran down his face. The sound of gunfire echoed in a distorted and distant way. He tried to stand, but his body did not respond as it should. Severe injuries were already taking their toll. Around him, men were scattered, some motionless, others trying to hold on, while the enemy advanced closer and closer. And it was at that moment that the situation reached a level that few war accounts can accurately describe. Through the smoke, the fire, and the constant noise of combat, enemy soldiers began approaching the wounded. Some of them carried flamethrowers. The objective was clear: eliminate any survivor. Howard, still on the ground, gravely wounded without a functional weapon, understood exactly what was about to happen. There was no way to run. There was no way to fight in a conventional manner. He was behind enemy lines, surrounded, vulnerable, and about to be reached. It was in that instant that he did something that completely defines who he was as a soldier. Searching through what remained of his gear, he found a grenade. With difficulty, due to injuries in his hands, he managed to pull the pin and held the activation lever. The decision he made in that moment was not based on military strategy, nor on training. It was based on something much deeper. He decided that if that was the end, he would not go alone. As the enemy approached, he remained still, holding the grenade, waiting for the exact moment. When the soldier with the flamethrower finally got close enough, the two locked eyes. There were no shouts. There was no rush. Only the silent recognition that both knew exactly what was about to happen. Howard was ready to sacrifice his own life, taking the enemy with him. But something unexpected happened. For a moment that seemed to last far longer than it should have, the enemy soldier hesitated, and then he stepped back. That decision, on the enemy's part, changed everything. Howard did not waste that second. He threw the grenade toward the man and immediately began to move. Not in search of safety for himself, but toward the others. Because even in that condition, his priority was not to survive alone. It was to keep fighting. It was to help those who were still alive. It was to fulfill the mission, even when everything already indicated that it had failed. Dragging himself across the terrain, he found his lieutenant, gravely wounded, practically unable to move. Without hesitation, Howard began pulling him, inch by inch, under enemy fire, completely ignoring his own condition. Every movement required extreme effort. Every second exposed increased the risk. But stopping was never an option. When he finally managed to reach a position with some of the survivors, the situation was still critical. The group was reduced, surrounded, with little ammunition and almost no resources. At any moment, a new attack could end everything. And it was in that scenario that Robert Howard, even wounded, took control of the situation. He began reorganizing the men, assigning positions, directing fields of fire, turning what remained of that group into a coordinated defense. At that moment, war stopped being only about survival. It became leadership under the worst possible conditions. And what would come next would be even more intense. What remained of that group was no longer an organized rescue team, but a small core of survivors surrounded in completely hostile territory, with no guarantee of extraction, and with the enemy applying constant and coordinated pressure. Even so, under the leadership of Robert Howard, that scenario began to change. Even wounded, with his body already pushed to the limit, he started acting with remarkable clarity, as if he completely ignored his own pain. His priority was simple and direct: keep everyone alive for as long as possible. He ordered all men capable of fighting to position themselves around the wounded lieutenant, forming an improvised defensive perimeter. There was no room for disorganization, no margin for error. Every man there needed to know exactly where he was and what he had to do. Meanwhile, the enemy pressure did not decrease. Small groups advanced through the vegetation, testing the defense, searching for gaps, trying to break the resistance of that isolated position. Howard quickly realized that if they did not receive air support, everyone there would eventually be eliminated. That was when he made a decision that very few would have had the courage to make in that situation. He began coordinating airstrikes almost directly on top of their own position. There was no safety margin, no comfortable distance. Every call had to be precise. Every instruction had to be exact, because any mistake would mean hitting their own men. To increase their chances of survival, he ordered signal lights to be placed around the perimeter, forming a visible marker for the aircraft. This required some men to expose themselves directly to enemy fire to place those markers on the ground. Even so, they went. And Howard was one of those who directly took part in that task. Crawling under constant fire, placing each reference point with the care of someone who knows that detail could be the only difference between life and death. With the perimeter established, the true test of endurance began. The enemy launched successive attacks, trying to break through the defense. Each assault was met with everything they had left in strength and ammunition: grenades, controlled fire, coordinated movement. It was not just combat, it was organized survival. And at the center of it all, Robert Howard remained on the radio, guiding aircraft, adjusting coordinates, describing enemy positions with precision, even with impaired vision and a completely wounded body. The first air support arrived with limited resources. Small aircraft, restricted firepower, nothing enough to completely neutralize the threat. Even so, each pass helped relieve some of the pressure. Howard took advantage of every second, reorganizing the men, redistributing ammunition, ensuring no one lost their position. But the enemy did not retreat. On the contrary, they intensified the attacks. At one of the most critical moments, a new enemy push nearly broke the perimeter. It was a direct and aggressive advance, attempting to eliminate the resistance once and for all. Howard responded by ordering the use of grenade launchers at specific points, creating a barrier of explosions that forced the enemy to retreat temporarily. It was a fast, precise, and absolutely essential decision. Without it, the group would have been overwhelmed. Time passed, but inside that perimeter, it felt like time no longer existed. Only cycles of attack and defense. Only the constant sound of gunfire, explosions, and commands being shouted in the middle of chaos. Howard's body was already showing clear signs of extreme exhaustion. Multiple wounds, blood loss, continuous physical effort. Even so, he remained active. He remained leading. He remained the point of stability in a completely unstable environment. And then, after hours of combat, heavier support aircraft finally appeared. Armed helicopters began to arrive, but the situation was still far from resolved. The extraction had to be coordinated with extreme care. The enemy remained close, still capable of hitting the aircraft during landing. Every rescue attempt was a massive risk. Howard, once again, took responsibility. He began organizing the evacuation, prioritizing the most severely wounded, ensuring that no one would be left behind. Every man pulled out of there was a victory, but he himself refused any attempt at early evacuation. His position was clear: he would leave last, because for him, it was never about himself. It was about everyone else. And the most critical moment was still yet to come. When the extraction helicopters began to approach once again, the situation was still extremely unstable. The aerial presence helped, but it did not eliminate the threat. The enemy remained nearby, hidden in the dense vegetation, waiting for the right moment to strike during the landing. And that is exactly what happened. The moment the aircraft attempted to descend, a new wave of intense gunfire began hitting the extraction zone. The sound of machine guns mixed with the roar of the rotors created an environment that was almost impossible to coordinate. Pilots had to decide in fractions of a second whether to continue the descent or abort the mission. Any mistake at that point meant losing the entire aircraft. On the ground, Robert Howard fully understood what was at stake. If that attempt failed, there would likely not be another. The group was already at its absolute limit. Ammunition was low, men were wounded, and physical endurance was nearly gone. This was the moment where everything had to work. And once again, he took responsibility for making it happen. Even with his body compromised, he repositioned himself, coordinating the movement of the men, reorganizing the perimeter to create a minimal window of safety for the helicopters to land. But the enemy understood that as well. A new offensive began, even more aggressive than the previous ones. Gunfire came from multiple directions. Grenades exploded nearby. The pressure was total. It was a clear attempt to prevent any kind of extraction. It was at that moment that Howard made one of the most extreme decisions of the entire operation. With no other viable alternative, he went back to the radio and requested an airstrike, practically on top of their own position. There was no safe distance. There was no comfortable margin. It was a decision that put everyone at immediate risk, but it also represented the only chance to break the enemy's advance. The coordinates were delivered with precision. Seconds later, the sound of attack aircraft tore through the sky. The impact was devastating. Explosions shook the ground around them. Vegetation was torn apart, and the enemy's advance was brutally halted. But the proximity of the strike was so extreme that shrapnel and ricochets hit Howard himself. One of the impacts struck his face directly. Any other man at that point would have completely lost the ability to continue. But he did not stop. Still conscious, still focused, still in command. With the airstrike creating a brief window of opportunity, the helicopters finally managed to begin the extraction. One by one, the men started to be pulled out. The wounded first, then those who were still able to move. Each boarding was carried out under risk, under pressure, under the constant threat of new incoming fire. And in the middle of all this, Howard continued coordinating, ensuring that no one was left behind, maintaining organization until the very last second. When nearly everyone had been extracted, only a few men remained on the perimeter, and among them, still on the ground, was Robert Howard. Even in that condition, he stayed until he was absolutely certain that all the others had boarded. Only then did he allow himself to be taken. When he finally entered the helicopter, there was no celebration. There was no immediate sense of victory. What remained was the weight of everything that had happened. Hours of continuous combat, decisions made under extreme pressure, lives saved in the middle of a situation that, from the beginning, seemed impossible to survive. The helicopter pulled away from the combat zone, leaving behind the jungle that, for hours, had been the stage of one of the most intense episodes of that war. And inside it, among the wounded, silence, and exhaustion, was a man who had pushed his body to the absolute limit to ensure that others could make it out alive. But the impact of that mission would not end there, because what Robert Howard did that day went beyond any ordinary definition of courage. When the operation came to an end and the survivors were finally extracted from that combat zone, the true scale of what had happened began to become clear. What had initially been a rescue mission had turned into a direct confrontation against a much larger force in completely hostile territory without any strategic advantage. And even so, against all odds, a group of soldiers had managed to make it out alive. But that did not happen by chance. It was not luck. It was not coincidence. It was the direct result of decisions made under extreme pressure, of leadership in a scenario where any mistake meant immediate death, and of an absolute willingness to place the lives of others above one's own. Robert L. Howard did not leave that mission as an ordinary man. He left as someone who had, in practice, redefined what leadership in combat truly means. Wounded multiple times, with his body already pushed to its physical limits, he kept moving forward, kept fighting, kept organizing, kept protecting. At no point did he choose the easier path. At no point did he prioritize his own safety. Every decision he made was based on a single principle: no one would be left behind. And that is exactly what he ensured. In the months and years that followed, the details of that operation began to emerge, many of them still limited by the level of secrecy surrounding missions conducted by MACVSOG. Even so, what could be confirmed was already enough to demonstrate the magnitude of what had been done. It was not just a single act of bravery. It was a continuous sequence of actions under extreme conditions, maintaining control, clarity, and leadership in an environment where everything favored failure. And that is why, on March 2nd, 1971, Robert L. Howard received the highest military decoration of the United States, the Medal of Honor. But for him, it was never about personal recognition. In one of his own statements, he made clear what that medal truly meant. His father and his uncles had fought and died during World War II. For him, that honor was not his alone. It was shared. It was a continuation of a legacy, a reflection of something greater than a single man. And perhaps that is exactly what makes this story even more impactful. Because despite everything he did, despite everything he endured, despite everything he faced, he never placed himself above others. Stories like this do not exist to glorify war. They exist to show what some men are capable of when placed in the most extreme situations possible. They exist to remind us that in the midst of chaos, pain, and fear, there are still choices. And that those choices can define not only who survives, but who makes a difference. In that jungle, on that day, surrounded, wounded, without guarantees, Robert Howard made choices that saved lives. Choices that required more than training, more than physical strength. They required character. They required courage at its purest level. And that is why, decades later, his story continues to be told. Not just as a historical record, but as a real example of what it means not to retreat, not to give up, and not to abandon those who depend on you, because in the end, that is what remains. And it was after a life marked by these principles that, on December 23, 2009, in the city of Waco, Texas, his journey came to an end, leaving behind a legacy that continues to span generations.